Hi, I'm Billy Frederick, and I'm a Dungeon Master. For the past few months, I've been organizing and running a West Marches style Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition campaign. In this process, I've had my fair share of problems to solve and experiences that I can only assume are inherent to the style of the game. I started up in late January, early February, and had to kind of figure things out for myself. So the goal for this podcast is to accelerate that process for you to quickly bridge the gap between the West Marches style game on paper and actually running it for yourself. So before I start giving actual advice, I need to clarify what a West Marches game is, so when I talk and discuss, we all have the same definition of the subject of the series. The definition I'm going to present is going to be a working definition. It's by no means comprehensive. A West Marches style game is a style of tabletop role-playing game that differs from your typical weekly game in a few ways. It doesn't need a regular party, it doesn't need a regular time, and it doesn't have an established plot. If you really want an in-depth explanation of this, check out Matt Colville's West Marches video. He's a fantastic guide for novice and experienced DMs alike. He makes deeply insightful videos about the art that is running the game, but for our purposes, this simple definition should do. Now, normally, and by normally I mean in a conventional weekly set party game, these three things would each be a wrench in the gears that is a smoothly running role-playing game. However, one man's bug is another man's feature. As disruptive as each of these can be for a home game, they each present some of their own upsides, and I'm going to go through each one and explain how each is to your benefit in this style of game. That's going to be the meat of this little introductory episode. So the first point, it has no regular party. Because availabilities fluctuate and schedules change and life happens, the same sessions aren't going to happen every week, and that's okay. What this does, I find, is it breathes quite a lot of life and strategy into the game that a fixed party composition doesn't have. For instance, you might find yourself running with two paladins, a fighter, and a barbarian, and they're going to want to hack and slash, and you're going to let them, and they're going to find themselves in a social encounter, and they're going to get stuck, and you're going to have to send in the bard in at some point to go smooth things over. The next week, you'll have rogues and gloomstalkers and shadow monks ready to get down with some infiltration and assassination. And that's also going to be cool. This principle works on the premise that while there is bad D&D, any D&D can be good. And if you want my 2 cents, I think party composition is largely overrated. These large and fluctuating parties are sustained by a much larger potential group. Now, I don't have an optimal size to give you for a West Marches game, but I can ballpark a range. I think at minimum you should have enough people on deck for 2 full parties. So about 8 to 10 is a good starting spot. The upper bound of this is a bit trickier because it's limited by how many games you want to run per week. If you feel like running 2 sessions in a week, you're going to have some difficulty satisfying 30 plus players in a reasonably sized sessions. Going off anecdotal experience, I have about 25 players that run 3-ish sessions a week of 5 to 6 players, each player playing once per week. And the way this is pulled off brings us to point number 2. It has no regular time. If you or your players' schedules change often and setting a regular time for games becomes difficult, floating session times can work very well. But first, a story. One of the big advances that was made in military strategy in the First World War was a bottom-up style of organization that led to a tremendous flexibility in troop responses. The traditional way of conducting warfare would be that a high-ranking officer would give an order, it would work its way down the chain of command, and the soldiers in the trenches would receive orders that were reflective of the situation at the time they were given, rather than the situation they were received in. The new way of commanding would be the commanding officer giving a general objective, and the lower ranking officers and soldiers would have to adapt their strategy to what would be most likely to succeed in accomplishing that objective. This method of bottom-up organization is closely analogous to the way that sessions of West March's games are scheduled. The Dungeon Master gives to the players a general overview of their ability. Groups of players coalesce by commonly available free time, and once all of the details are worked out, they work it out with the or a Dungeon Master. As a Dungeon Master, this is incredibly convenient because it takes the stress off you to herd players for a session by offloading that task onto them. And to the last point being, it does not need a plot. This statement has a huge potential to trip people up, and it is definitely liable to cause the most contention, but I stand by it. What the West Marches does best is sandboxing. It epitomizes the notion of free will in a fantasy setting. Players are free to follow their own agenda rather than one prescribed for them. But, you may ask, if there's no plot, what will the players do? To which I reply, you don't feel as though your daily life exists in the structure of a narrative, yet you still find things to do. To get the meat of my approach to plot and the apparent lack thereof, I must first discuss something that comes from my education in history. When historians study history, one of the main pitfalls to avoid is approaching it teleologically. What this means is that history is not to be understood working backwards from the present. Doing so causes the historian to attach their inherently subjective views on the features of the present into an ideally objective past. We think of the past as a story to which we are the conclusion. However, those figures in history did not consider themselves part of a story. They're humans in their own present, making decisions reflective of their values and abilities. This is a feeling that I seek to create in the West Marches. Create enough fixtures to interact with and sprinkle in some tension until someone decides to shake up the realm. The story, as it were, emerges in hindsight as players recount the events of the past, just as history unfurls behind us. Okay, but why? Well, I find that this approach to role-playing removes a large portion of metagaming in that the players cannot be aware that they are in a story if they are not in a story. They do not seek the course of action that they feel the Dungeon Master wants them to take, because I genuinely have absolutely no stake in their decisions, I have no agenda, there is no endgame. Only further situations for them to encounter and to navigate. To attempt to peer beyond the world and see story structure would be as insane as if you were to do so in your own life, because just as in your own life, there is no structure. Nothing is meant to happen, you drive what will become your story. To put it another way, it creates a sameness in perspective in both the players and their characters. There is less disbelief to suspend, thus strengthening verisimilitude. That said, I want to wrap up with where I intend to take this series in the future. Its objective is to take the things that I've learned over the course of the past months of running and continuing to run an online West Marches game. So, rather paradoxically, I'll define what I envision for this series by what I don't. This is not a series that will explicitly teach you how to run D&D or tabletop role-playing games in general. That's a different series created by the giant upon whose shoulders many DMs stand, and that series is Matt Colville's Running the Game series, whom I mentioned earlier. If you've never run D&D and you want to, watch his videos. If you do run D&D and want to supplement your experience with the perspectives of a seasoned DM, writer, and game designer, watch his videos. But what I'll be doing, or attempting to do, is give you an overview of the methods and tools that I use, some of the decisions I've made, and the thought processes behind why. So what should you expect? Well, I'm going to be going over topics that will be divided into two broad categories. Things that come before you run your first session, and things that come after the first session. But those are for subsequent episodes. The next episode will be titled Tools of the Trade, and I'm going to run through all the programs and sites I use to set up my game and still use to keep it going. Until then, I'm Billy Frederick, and this has been Marching West. Thank you.